I'm going to invite Michelle Adeyinka to come talk to us about the UK housing industry and practice and the motivation for setting up the Nigerian UK Housing Society. Michelle Adeyinka is currently the president of that society, which brings together housing professionals of mainly Nigerian origin and also other African countries who work in the UK to share their knowledge and experience successful projects at local, regional, and national levels. She has recently returned to housing operations with Affinity Sutton Homes, one of the largest housing associations in the UK. Michelle is committed to actively working to improve housing provision and life opportunities for vulnerable households and communities in the UK. She's also a very, very strong fundraiser, so we're really happy to have you here. Thank you. Welcome, Ms. Michelle Adeyinka.
Thank you all very much, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak at this event, which is a real honor and privilege for NUHS. Although we are partners, but you know, to be invited for something like this, we really appreciate it. So thank you very much, Professor Nubi and his team for this invitation and for also setting up this workshop. I'm really glad that we're now at the stage where we're seeing the results of our investment in UNILAG, as it were, by having these series of workshops, which I hope we will continue to be a part of in the future. Okay, so I've been asked to discuss the housing industry and practice in the UK and the motivation for NUHS. Well, that's a pretty tall order for me in my very limited time period I have, but I'll try and give you a very brief overview. The housing sector, as we call it in the UK, has changed considerably in the last century, but the issues remain almost the same in 2015. Generally, the UK housing sector is significantly rooted into three tenures, mainly home ownership, the private rented sector, and social housing. There are also new emerging sectors of shared ownership and the rent-to-buy sectors. These are a response to the housing shortage which we're experiencing in the UK at the moment. Each of these tenures are separate studies in themselves, so I'm not even going to try to attempt to cover issues about those three sectors at this meeting, but I hope that at some point in the future we will be able to work with UNILAG, CHS to run workshops or training programs, covering those specific areas and some of the learnings and some of the practices from those sectors that can be applied in Nigeria. However, today I'll touch on the first two sectors, but focus more on social housing sector, which I have been involved in for the past 20 years. Now, I'd like to disappoint all of you because we have exactly the same type of challenges in the UK as you have in Nigeria. We don't know it all. We're not perfect. We haven't solved the housing problem. It is still very much around after nearly after a century of social housing in the UK. It is still very much a problem that we're grappling with. But, you know, it's a cycle. It is something that you get right today, but you need to innovate, you need to improve on it. So you have these periods when we get it right, it works for a while, and then we move on and we find ourselves back to square one, where there's housing shortage, homelessness is on the increase, we don't have supply, or the supply that we do have is not decent for our standards. So home ownership, though, is still, Home ownership is the largest sector, although this is at an all-time low of 64%, mainly due to the challenge for first-time buyers who are unable to access the property ladder, as we call it, because of the very stringent conditions for acquiring mortgages. I mean, I don't know, I'm not assuming that most people know what the average house price is in the UK, but it's £240,000 for an average property, and we're talking about a 2-bedroom possibly in the UK. And then you have the average income, which is £24,000 per annum. Now, the way we award mortgages is that it is usually based on a multiple of your income. So obviously you would have maybe 3 or 4 times your income. So somebody who's on 24,000, that's less than £100,000, and they want to acquire a property that's costing possibly 240 to 250,000 pounds. It just doesn't add up. The finance doesn't add up, so they end up not being able to obtain their own home, and then it means it creates a lot of pressure on the private rented sector and obviously the social rented sector. And I'm sure, as I said, some of the pioneers of social housing, such as Octavia Hill, Joseph Rowntree, and William Sutton, would be overwhelmed with the new challenges of social housing, as we again see an increase in the number of homeless people, a shortage of suitable accommodation for those in need, new categories of need for those who are unable to buy their own home or rent in the private sector, as they cannot afford to access either tenure. So what happens to those people? I mean, and most of these people are people who are working. You know, in the past, we used to think that the people who needed our help were those who were on low incomes or people who, you know, had one challenge or the other. And so therefore, the state had to step in to be able to make sure that they had a roof over their heads. But clearly, we have a new generation of people who are working, they're active, they're in, you know, they're earning, but they can't afford to access any type of housing, either in the private sector or through home ownership. So most of them end up living at home. We've got 40-year-olds who are still living with their parents, I'm afraid, in the UK, and that's a very sad trend. So in terms of provision, I kind of liked your picture, Professor Nubi, about the tower blocks coming down, because I think that was a big mistake. We could very well do with those houses again. The number of units that we lost with the demolition of high-rise, which at the time was logical, made sense. It was done based on evidence and research. The research showed that those who were living in tower blocks had you know, they had a lot of issues. You know, there were security issues, there were safety issues. There was even the issues about the fabric of the properties. Some of them were under the threat of, you know, falling down. We had a few that did actually collapse, and I think that's what triggered the issue, you know, the tide against tower blocks. But, you know, when we look at it now, in the position we're in 2015, when there's such a serious shortage, we wonder whether that was the right thing to do, whether we could have improved on those units, we could have remodernized them and kept them, because of the, you know, moving from high density to low density and creating homes was an idealistic vision, obviously, and that was why we knocked down those tower blocks. But, you know, as I said, in terms of provision, in the 1960s, tower blocks for social housing was the best option then, but not in the 90s, and then we knocked them down. But as demand now exceeds supply, we're now beginning to see a lot more tower blocks being built. Housing associations, I passed one the other day, and I was like, oh my gosh, I thought it was a private developer until I saw the signboard where it said, Origin Housing Association, or was it Genesis? I can't remember. And I was like, wow, so we're building tower blocks again. That's amazing. So I think what I'm just trying to say is that, you know, everything is a cycle sometimes. We try one thing, it works for a while, and then based on research, and I think this is why this event is really, really key, because without research, you can't determine what needs to be done, you know. And I think that what I've just try to express here is that obviously with the issues about housing, the industry is ever changing and needs to be sustained with adequate data and research that can show what works, what needs to change, and the reason why that change needs to take place. So that is what drives a lot of the changes in the UK as well. So I'm so pleased that we've got University of Lagos, championing the drive for research and